I left my restoration equipment at my son's house. When I went back to get it, I accidentally overheard a conversation between him and my daughter-in-law. I said nothing. 2 weeks later, when they finally made their move, I smiled. I've been restoring furniture for 37 years. A clamping jig and a moisture meter aren't just tools to me. They're the difference between a piece that holds and one that falls apart in 6 months. So when I got halfway home from Darren's that Thursday afternoon and realized I'd left them in his garage, I turned my truck around without thinking twice. It was a short drive back. Paula's car was in the driveway. Darren must have gotten home while I was on the road because his truck was there too. I used the side gate the way I always did. They'd told me to when Carol passed 4 years ago. "Dad, come and go as you need to," Darren had said, holding my shoulder the way his mother used to. I believed him then. The garage door was unlocked. I found the jig on the workbench where I'd left it, the moisture meter beside it. I was tucking them into my bag when I heard voices from the kitchen. The side door between the garage and the house was cracked open, maybe 2 inches. I wasn't trying to listen. 2 weeks is the right window, Darren said. His voice had a flatness I didn't recognize. By then the pattern's established. Novak sees what he needs to see. Paula answered from somewhere near the counter. And Clifford won't be a problem. Dad doesn't go to Clifford for everything. And even if he did, who's going to take the word of a confused old man over a documented medical record? I stood still. My hand was on the moisture meter. The guardianship filing takes how long after Novak signs off? 60 days, maybe less if we push. I set the meter down slowly and picked it back up. Then I walked out the way I came in. I closed the gate behind me. I drove home at exactly the speed limit. I didn't say a word to anyone that evening. The next morning I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything I remembered from that 2-minute conversation. Every name, every word I was certain of. Then I called Clifford Marsh. Clifford had handled Carol's estate. He'd handled the paperwork when I sold the shop. We'd known each other 38 years, not as friends exactly, but as 2 men who understood what the other one was worth. His secretary put me through in 4 minutes. "I need to ask you something about guardianship law," I said. Specifically what someone would need to do to petition for it. He was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual call, Walter. Come in this afternoon." I drove to his office on Brady Street and sat across from his desk and told him what I'd heard. Not everything, just enough. He listened without interrupting, which is something I've always valued about Clifford. When I finished, he said, "If what you're describing is accurate, what they're planning is elder abuse. Are you certain about what you heard?" "Every word," he leaned back. "Then here's what we need to do." He explained the Iowa one-party consent rule first. Any recording made in a space where I was a participant, or even a present party, was admissible. The conversation I'd overheard in Darren's garage qualified under the statute. If I could document future interactions in my own home, we'd have something concrete to bring forward. "What about the will?" I asked. Clifford pulled my file. The current document left everything to Darren. The house on Lombard Street, the savings account, the investments, $206,500 in total, give or take. I'd written it 3 months after Carol died, when I wasn't thinking clearly about much of anything. "I'd like to change it," I said. He nodded once. "I'll draw up options, come back Thursday." I drove home and started a second legal pad. At the top I wrote what they said versus what actually happened. I began filling it in. Darren called 2 days later, casual, just checking in. His voice was warm in a way that had a shape to it, a particular cadence I was beginning to map. "How are you feeling, Dad? You seemed a little off last time I saw you." I hadn't seemed anyway because he hadn't actually seen me in 5 days. I noted that on the legal pad after I hung up. "I'm fine," I told him. "Tired maybe. I keep misplacing things. That's what I mean. Paula and I have been talking. We think it might be worth seeing someone. A specialist. There's a Dr. Novak over in Bettendorf, very well reviewed. Dr. Whitfield's known me 22 years, I said. Right? But sometimes a fresh set of eyes. Let me think about it. I wasn't thinking about it. I was listening to how quickly he'd moved to Novak's name, how practiced the transition sounded. Fresh set of eyes had the quality of a phrase that had been tested before it was used. I wrote down the name, Peter Novak, Bettendorf. That same week, Paula stopped by with a folder of brochures, senior living communities, she called them. Wonderful amenities, she said. She spread them on my kitchen table and pointed to photographs of smiling residents in common rooms, activity schedules printed in large, clean fonts. I picked up the one on top, Sunset Pines Memory Care and Assisted Living. I read the fine print while Paula described the activity calendar. There were 2 wings noted in the facility overview. The second one was secured. Memory care, I said. Oh, that's just 1 wing. Most residents are completely independent. I kept my face neutral. These are expensive. Well, Dad, you can afford it. And getting in early, before there's a crisis, she stopped herself. We just want you to be safe. I said I'd look them over. I stacked them neatly after she left and set them beside the legal pad. Then I sat in Carol's chair for a while. They hadn't said anything I could argue with directly. They'd expressed concern. They'd brought information. Every move was legible as care if you didn't already know what you knew. That was the architecture of it, each piece innocent on its own, the pattern only visible from outside. I was outside it. That was the only advantage I had, and I intended to keep it. 3 days after the brochures, I came back from my morning walk along the river and found Darren's truck already parked in front of the house. It was 7:45. I hadn't been expecting him. I came around the side instead of the front. The living room window was raised an inch for the air. I did that every morning. I stayed on the porch side back against the siding and listened. A third voice was inside, a woman, professional cadence. Someone I didn't recognize. The charity designation is the core problem, she was saying. If Walter was in a diminished state when he made that change, the entire document is contestable. But you'd need guardianship in place first to give you legal standing to challenge it. Paula's voice. He rewrote it 14 months after Carol died. He was still grieving. He wasn't thinking like himself. Darren, he left everything, the house, all of it to a children's hospital. He never mentioned it to me once. That works in your favor, the woman said. Isolation of decision-making is consistent with early cognitive decline. Combine that with Novak's assessment and a documented pattern of confusion, and you have a reasonable basis for the petition. I heard a folder close. I walked back down the porch steps and around to the corner of the block and waited on the sidewalk until a car I didn't recognize pulled out of my driveway and turned north. I stood there for a moment with my hands in my jacket pockets. The house was worth $412,000. The savings and investments another, $214,500. That was the number. Not the activity calendars at Sunset Pines. Not the medication schedule or the clock drawing test. The number and the will that was currently standing between them and it. I'd written that will with Clifford present, 14 months after Carol's funeral, when I had thought clearly and carefully about what I wanted to leave behind. I'd left it to the children's hospital because 3 kids from our street had been treated there over the years, and because it was what Carol and I had always said we would do if we ever had more than we needed. I had not mentioned it to Darren because it was not his money to plan around. I went inside, added 3 lines to the legal pad, and called Clifford. Move up the Thursday meeting, I said, and pull whatever you need for the trust structure. I know exactly what I want. I was back in Clifford's office 2 days later. He had a draft already outlined. He'd anticipated the direction from our first conversation. The structure was a trust. The assets would be held for Owen and Lily until each of them turned 26. The house, the savings, the investments, all of it. And the trust language Clifford explained carefully would be explicit on one point. Neither Darren nor Paula Briggs could access, borrow against, or benefit from the trust in any capacity, under any circumstance. That's enforceable, I asked. Completely. You have the right to restrict beneficiaries by name. Courts have upheld more specific language than this. I read the draft twice. Then I read the exclusion clause a third time. There was also a second document Clifford had prepared, a referral to Dr. Alan Whitfield for a full cognitive assessment, dated that week. Whitfield had been my doctor for 22 years. He knew my history, my baseline, the difference between a man who was declining and a man who was being watched for decline. If Novak was going to establish one record, I needed another one, a real one, from someone who couldn't be redirected. He'll have the results back within the week, Clifford said. I signed the trust documents in front of 2 witnesses his office had arranged. He locked them in the safe behind his desk. He handed me the recording device last, about the size of a thumb drive, already charged, voice activated. He set it on the table between us and explained the placement again. Stable surface, unremarkable position, line of sight to wherever a conversation was likely to happen. Now we wait, he said. I put the device in my shirt pocket and drove home. The river was flat and gray through the passenger window. I thought about the legal pad sitting on my kitchen table, The two columns that kept getting longer, what they'd said, what had actually happened. They thought they were building a record. They were, just not the one they intended. The appointment with Dr. Novak was on a Tuesday. Darren drove. Paula sat in the back with her folder, the same one she'd brought to my kitchen table with the brochures inside. Nobody talked much on the way over. Darren asked once if I'd eaten breakfast. I said I had. Novak's office was in a low brick building off State Street in Bettendorf. Clean waiting room, neutral art on the walls, the kind of space designed to feel neither clinical nor warm. A woman at the front desk took my insurance card and handed me a clipboard. I filled it out slowly the way I'd practiced. Novak himself was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, efficient in the way doctors get when they see too many patients in a day and have learned to compress everything into the first 10 minutes. He shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from his desk, and asked Darren and Paula to wait outside. He asked me about my routine when I woke up, whether I cooked for myself, how I managed my medications. I answered in a way that introduced small hesitations. Not confusion exactly, more like a man reaching for something just slightly out of range. He noted things on his pad without looking up. He asked about my sleep. I told him I woke up sometimes not quite knowing where I was. He wrote that down too. When he asked me to draw a clock showing 10 past 11, I drew it slightly off, the minute hand a fraction short, the numbers crowded on one side. When he read me a list of words to repeat back 5 minutes later, I missed one. When he asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, I paused too long between numbers. I was aiming for a specific target. Early stage concern, nothing definitive. Enough to give them what they needed for the next step. Not enough to trigger anything I couldn't control or predict. He spoke with Darren and Paula privately for about 12 minutes while I sat in a chair in the hallway. A woman across from me was reading a magazine. The fluorescent light above her buzzed at a frequency just below noticeable. Through the wall I caught fragments of Novak's voice. Baseline established. Recommend follow-up in 3 months. Family involvement advisable at this stage. On the drive home, Paula turned from the front seat and said it was a good first step. That Dr. Novak seemed very thorough. That it was smart to have these things documented early. Her voice had a particular quality relief trying to present itself as concern. I watched the river through the passenger window and said I suppose she was right. I noted Novak's exact phrasing on the legal pad that evening. Both columns were getting long. What they'd said, what had actually happened. The two lists looked nothing alike. 4 days after the appointment, Darren called in the early evening. The warmth in his voice had a new quality underneath it, something compressed, like a spring being held down by a hand that was getting tired. Dad, Renee Stanton, has a narrow window in her schedule. She's the social worker we mentioned, the one who specializes in these transitions. A breath. If we wait much longer, the room at Sunset Pines won't be available. I don't want you to lose the placement over timing. I said whatever day worked for Renee worked for me. After I hung up, I went to the living room and checked the recording device on the lamp table. Still charged, position unchanged. I moved Carol's photograph 2 inches to the left so the device read as part of the surface. Something that had always been there, something that belonged. They were compressing the timeline. The Novak assessment had given them the medical language they needed, and now the window was closing before I could find someone to talk to, ask questions they couldn't answer, or simply sit with it long enough to pick up a phone and call a lawyer on my own initiative. That was the design of it. I was supposed to feel it narrowing around me and sign because the alternative was losing the room, losing the spot, falling further behind a timeline I didn't control. I went to bed and slept without difficulty. They came on a Thursday, 10 days after Novak. Darren, Paula, and a woman named Renee Stanton, who introduced herself as a social worker specializing in elder transitions. She had a soft voice, a measured cadence, and a folder she set on her knee when she sat down. They arranged themselves across from me in my own living room. The recording device was on the lamp table to my left, 18 inches from where Renee had placed her bag. Renee said Dr. Novak's assessment indicated early cognitive changes. She said the family had identified a placement at Sunset Pines. A room in the memory care wing had opened ahead of schedule, which was fortunate given the usual waiting period. She said in her experience, early transitions were less disorienting than later ones. People adjusted better when the decision was made before a crisis, rather than during one. I want to stay in my home, I said. Of course you do, Paula said quickly. Her voice was gentle, practiced. This is just to hold the spot while you adjust to the idea. Nothing is final yet. Darren pushed a document across the coffee table toward me. I picked it up and read it in full, all 4 pages, every clause. It was not preliminary paperwork. It was a comprehensive power of attorney granting Marcus complete authority over my medical decisions, my financial accounts, my property, and my right to determine where I lived. It had been drafted to look like a placeholder for someone who wouldn't read it carefully, someone who was confused and tired and just wanted his family to stop worrying. I could feel them watching my hands, waiting for the moment I'd reach for the pen. "I want to call Clifford Marsh first," I said. The room shifted. Not dramatically, Paula's expression didn't break. Renee kept her posture. Darren didn't move. But something changed in the quality of the silence. A stillness that had been comfortable became something else. "Dad, it's really just standard paperwork. Then Clifford will have no objection to looking it over." Renee checked her watch and said she had another client she needed to get to. They could reconvene tomorrow if that was easier. "It wasn't a problem," Darren said. Of course, take whatever time I needed." They gathered their folders and Paula put the power of attorney back in her bag without asking for it. I walked them to the door and stood on the porch until Paula's car reached the end of the block and turned. Then I went inside, sat down in Carol's chair, and looked at the lamp table for a moment. The device had been running for 94 minutes. I picked up the phone and called Clifford. "Tomorrow morning," he said before I'd finished explaining. 10 o'clock, my office. Tell them to bring the social worker." Clifford's conference room held 5 people without crowding. He'd arranged the chairs deliberately. Darren and Paula sat with their backs to the window, the afternoon light coming from behind me, falling across the table between us. He set the recording device in the center of the table, before anyone had settled into their seats. Darren looked at it. "What is that? A recording made in Walter's home during yesterday's meeting," Clifford said. His voice was the same tone he used for everything, even, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent 38 years in rooms like this one. Iowa Code 808A, one-party consent. Walter was present throughout the conversation. The recording is fully admissible in any legal proceeding in this state. He pressed play. Paula's voice came through first, asking about the Sunset Pines timeline, whether the room in the memory care wing could still be held. Then Darren's voice confirming the scope of what they'd brought, not a placeholder, he'd said to Renee before arriving. Complete authority, that was the goal of this visit. Then Renee, working through the documentation she'd been provided. The pattern of confusion Paula had compiled. The incidents she'd described in writing and submitted as evidence of decline. The flooded basement, the repeated medication calls, a behavioral history assembled from events that had never taken place. The recording ran 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it ended, the room was quiet enough that I could hear the building's ventilation system. I spoke directly to Darren. "I know about the investment losses," I said. "I know Paula found the charity trust when she was going through my insurance papers, and I know that's the moment the timeline accelerated." I set both legal pads on the table in front of him. "I know about the conversation in my living room 3 weeks ago, the lawyer you brought into my house without telling me, the argument you made that my decision-making had been isolated when I wrote that will. I was standing on my own porch. I heard every word through the window I open every morning." Darren's mouth opened slightly. He closed it. "I'm not finished." I kept my voice level, the same tone I'd use explaining a joinery technique to Owen. "I know you switched to Novak because Whitfield has known me for 22 years and his assessment would have been useless to you. I know every incident Paula reported to Renee, the flooded basement, the repeated medication calls, is fabricated. None of it happened. And I know the document you brought to my house yesterday was not preliminary paperwork. It was a complete legal transfer of authority over my life, written for a man you believed was too impaired to read it carefully." I paused. "That's what you built. That's what you brought into my house." Clifford opened the second folder. Dr. Alan Whitfield's cognitive assessment dated 11 days prior, conducted at his office on Kimberly Road, full battery of standardized tests. The results occupied 3 pages. The conclusion was a single clinical sentence at the bottom of the last page. No evidence of dementia, mild cognitive impairment, or diminished capacity consistent with the need for guardianship intervention. Patient presents as cognitively intact. Walter performed poorly on Dr. Novak's evaluation deliberately, Clifford said. He understood what was being constructed. He chose to document the process rather than confront it directly, which is why everything you said in his home over the past 3 weeks is on record. Paula looked at the Whitfield report. She looked at it for a long time, then she looked at me. You staged the entire thing. I protected myself, I said, from a plan that was already running before I knew it existed. Every step I took was a legal response to something you'd already set in motion. You want to compare what was built here, both legal pads are on the table. You're welcome to read them. Renee Stanton had not spoken since the recording ended. She stood now, closed her folder with one deliberate motion, and lifted her briefcase from the floor. I was provided with fabricated incident documentation, she said. She looked at Darren and then at Paula without heat, without judgment, the flat professional tone of someone drawing a boundary in writing. I'll be withdrawing from this case and noting the circumstances in my file. She walked to the door and closed it quietly behind her. The three of us sat with that for a moment. Darren's voice had changed. The warmth was completely gone now, not angry exactly, but stripped down to something underneath that had always been there. So that's it. You're cutting us out entirely. Clifford opened the trust documents and laid them flat on the table. Walter executed a revised estate plan 4 weeks ago, he said. The assets, the house on Lombard Street, the savings account, the investment portfolio are held in trust for Owen and Lily Briggs, accessible when each of them reaches age 26. The trust includes an explicit restriction. Darren Briggs and Paula Briggs are prohibited from accessing, borrowing against, pledging as collateral, or benefiting from the trust in any form, under any circumstance, at any point. He slid the copies across the table. This is not a draft. It is fully executed, properly witnessed and secured. Darren picked up the document. He found the exclusion clause on the second page and read it once. Then he read it again. His expression was the expression of a man recalculating something he believed was already solved. Paula said, "That can't be enforceable." "It is entirely enforceable," Clifford said. "Walter has the legal right to direct his estate to any party he chooses, with whatever restrictions he deems appropriate. Courts in this state have upheld more specific exclusion language than what you're reading." The room was quiet. Outside on Brady Street, a delivery truck moved past the window. "You were going to inherit everything," I said. I wasn't raising my voice. There was no need to. "The original will left it all, to you. And instead of asking me why I'd changed it, instead of one honest conversation, you brought in a doctor you'd selected because he didn't know me, fabricated a medical history for a social worker, and put together paperwork designed to transfer control of my life to you before I understood what was happening." I looked at him. "That's the choice you made." He set the document down. He didn't look at Paula. "There's one additional item," Clifford said, setting a single page on the table. "A funded account designated for family counseling. Should either of you choose to use it, at any point, for any reason, the funds are available. There's no time limit on the offer." Darren stood. Paula put everything back into her folder, the power of attorney, the Sunset Pines application, the documentation she'd built, all of it without value now. They left together. At the end of the hall, the elevator opened and closed. Clifford refilled my coffee from the carafe on the credenza. Neither of us said anything for a while, which was exactly right. 6 months later, I was living in a 2-bedroom condominium 12 minutes from Owen School. The house on Lombard had sold in 19 days. The proceeds sat in the trust. I kept enough in a separate account to live on and to fit out the workshop I'd set up in the storage unit 2 floors below, second-hand bench, decent lighting. The tools I'd kept when I closed the shop. Owen came on Saturday mornings. He was 16 and careful with his hands and asked better questions about why wood moves the way it does than his father ever had. Lily came too, and mostly read on the couch, but sometimes she set her book face down on her knee and watched us work, following the logic of it without asking to explain it. One Saturday she looked up and asked why her parents didn't come with them anymore. I set down the spokeshave. "Sometimes people make choices that cost them something they didn't expect to lose," I said. "Your dad and I are still working on it." She considered that for a moment the way she considered most things and went back to her page. Darren had called twice in 6 months. The second call had lasted longer. At the end of it, after a silence that held its own weight, he'd asked about the counseling account, whether it was still there, whether it had any conditions attached. I told him it was still there. I told him there were no conditions. I told him to take his time. Outside the workshop window, the river moved the way it always did in early winter, steady and indifferent, carrying everything downstream without asking anyone's permission. I picked up the spokeshave and went back to work.